Week after 50, do these 5 exercises to reclaim your power. That muscle loss after 50 is inevitable story? It's wrong. A recent clinical study found men who did just 5 specific exercises rebuilt real strength and metabolic power. No decline required. This isn't fighting aging, it's staying strong on your terms. Most of what men over 50 are told about health didn't originate from research on men over 50. It came from general population studies, broad samples averaging together 25-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and retirees, then handing everyone the same recommendation. Guidance built for a younger frame, applied unchanged to a body now operating under an entirely different set of biological rules. That gap matters. It separates counsel that merely sounds sensible from counsel that genuinely produces results at this stage of life. Consider a simple example. 2 men follow identical instructions: reduce portions, walk daily, limit red meat. One is 28, the other is 56. Their outcomes diverge, not because either man lacks discipline, but because their underlying physiology no longer processes the same inputs the same way. Today, we'll examine 2 pieces of conventional wisdom, recommendations you've likely encountered dozens of times, and compare them against findings specific to men past 50. Afterward, we'll unpack the underlying biological reasons standard guidance falls short here, followed by a practical path forward. One more thing worth naming before we start. None of what follows is about blame. Plenty of disciplined, hardworking men followed conventional guidance exactly as instructed and still watched their strength fade, their waistline expand, and their energy flatten. That outcome doesn't reflect a lack of willpower. It reflects instructions poorly matched to the body receiving them. Once the instructions match the biology, effort finally produces the results it deserves. 5 sections. Straightforward delivery. Let's begin. Point 1. The first piece of common advice: eat less, move more. Calorie restriction as the primary strategy for weight and health. This ranks among the oldest instructions in health media. Reduce intake, increase output. The arithmetic appears straightforward. Common advice: cut calories aggressively. Treat weight loss as the primary marker of health. If the scale moves down, you're winning. The researched reality. For men past 50, aggressive calorie restriction, pursued without a deliberate protein and resistance training strategy, tends to strip away lean tissue at a disproportionately high rate, rather than targeting fat stores specifically. Here's why that distinction carries more weight than most people assume. When a 28-year-old reduces intake, his body preferentially protects muscle and draws energy from fat reserves instead. His hormonal environment, elevated testosterone, stronger growth hormone pulsatility, efficient protein synthesis, supports that preferential outcome. A man past 50 lacks that same buffer. Research examining age-related body composition consistently demonstrates that under identical caloric restriction, older adults lose a meaningfully larger proportion of lean mass relative to fat compared to younger counterparts undergoing matched reductions. So picture the man who successfully sheds 20 pounds through calorie cutting alone. He steps on the scale, feels victorious. But if 12 of those pounds came from muscle rather than fat, he hasn't gained health. He's traded visible weight for something researchers now regard as considerably more dangerous: diminished muscular reserve, a slower resting metabolism, and elevated frailty risk years down the road. The number on the scale dropped. His underlying vitality did not rise to match it. This is the quiet failure baked into eat less, move more as a standalone approach after 50. The advice isn't false, it's incomplete. And the missing piece happens to be exactly the piece that would have protected him. Think of muscle here as a reserve account rather than mere decoration. Draw it down carelessly during a restrictive phase, and you're not simply losing appearance. You're depleting the very tissue responsible for regulating blood sugar, supporting joint stability, and keeping your resting metabolism from stalling. Restriction without a protective strategy spends down that reserve precisely when you can least afford the withdrawal. Point 2, the second piece of common advice: do more cardio, prioritizing cardiovascular exercise as the primary training mode. The second widely accepted recommendation is almost universal. Heart health becomes paramount with age, so prioritize cardio. Walking, running, cycling, elevate the pulse, safeguard the cardiovascular system. Common advice: cardiovascular training should serve as the centerpiece of a fitness routine for men past 50, since heart disease remains the leading risk factor at this age. The researched reality: cardiovascular fitness genuinely matters. That portion holds true. Yet, research examining mortality risk in aging populations shows two additional markers predicting long-term outcomes just as strongly, and in certain studies even more strongly, than cardiovascular capacity alone: grip strength and total muscle mass. Multiple longitudinal studies tracking older adults have found that grip strength, a simple proxy for whole-body muscular capacity, correlates with all-cause mortality independent of cardiovascular fitness scores. Participants in the lowest strength percentile for their age bracket show significantly elevated risk, even when their cardiovascular readings appear entirely normal. Why would strength predict survival alongside cardiovascular health? Because muscle serves purposes well beyond lifting objects. Past 50, skeletal tissue functions essentially as an endocrine organ. It absorbs and processes the majority of circulating blood glucose. It regulates insulin sensitivity directly. Less muscle translates to harder blood sugar management, elevated risk of metabolic syndrome, and a body inclined to store fat more readily, particularly visceral fat, the variety surrounding internal organs and fueling systemic inflammation. Cardio alone rarely builds or preserves that tissue. In certain cases, excessive endurance work without accompanying strength training can accelerate muscular decline in older populations because the body adapts toward endurance demands without receiving the resistance stimulus that signals it to retain or rebuild lean tissue. None of this suggests cardio is misguided. It means treating cardio as the centerpiece at the expense of resistance training addresses a different problem than the one most men past 50 actually face. Picture two neighbors, both 53, both committed to daily 40-minute walks for a full year. One adds nothing else. The other adds 2 brief strength sessions weekly. 12 months later, both may show similar cardiovascular numbers on paper. Yet the second neighbor typically carries more lean tissue, manages blood sugar more efficiently, and reports fewer aches climbing stairs. Same cardiovascular commitment, vastly different trajectory, because one man addressed a variable the other left untouched. Point 3. The longevity science angle. Why the body's rules shift past 50 and what actually works instead. So why does guidance effective at 30 stop performing equally well at 55? The answer traces back to a mechanism researchers term anabolic resistance. Here's how it functions, described plainly. Regardless of age, consuming protein and performing resistance exercise sends signals prompting muscle repair and expansion. In younger bodies, that signal operates efficiently. Moderate protein combined with a moderate training stimulus produces a robust building response. Past 50, the identical signal requires a substantially higher dose to yield the same outcome. Studies measuring protein synthesis rates across younger versus older participants have found aging tissue demands meaningfully greater protein per meal, paired with a stronger resistance stimulus to trigger equivalent repair and growth. This phenomenon constitutes anabolic resistance. The body hasn't abandoned its capacity to build. Rather, the threshold required has risen, and conventional guidance rarely adjusts accordingly. It continues recommending identical moderate protein intake and the same cardio-heavy exercise split suitable at 30, then labels the resulting muscular decline an unavoidable, unfixable consequence of growing older. It isn't unavoidable, it's simply underdosed relative to what's now required. The evidence-based approach reframes strategy around 2 pillars. Sufficient protein, generally higher than standard dietary guidelines suggest, distributed more evenly across meals throughout the day, paired with resistance training, specifically targeting major muscle groups at intensity sufficient to clear that elevated threshold. Combine both consistently, and you're collaborating with your biology at this stage, rather than working against it. Muscle gets preserved, metabolic function improves, and that inevitable decline narrative starts resembling a failure of strategy far more than an immutable law of biology. Point 4. What this looks like in practice. To be clear, none of this calls for abandoning calorie awareness or cardiovascular exercise entirely. Both retain genuine value. The shift lies in priority and sequencing. Rather than calorie restriction serving as the primary lever, protein intake and resistance training become the primary levers. Moderate calorie awareness layered underneath as support, rather than sitting at the center. Rather than cardio occupying the centerpiece position, resistance training takes that role, roughly 2 to 4 sessions weekly targeting major muscle groups, with cardiovascular work layered in afterward for heart and metabolic benefit, functioning as complement rather than sole strategy. This reasoning underpins precisely why 5 particular exercises anchor this program. Nothing here was chosen arbitrarily. Each movement was selected to place meaningful resistance demand on a major muscle group, because that specific stimulus is exactly what evidence shows is required to clear the elevated threshold your body now operates under. 5 exercises, performed consistently, structured around what current evidence demonstrates works at this particular stage of life, not recycled guidance from decades earlier. Consider what changes practically. Breakfast shifts from a small serving of eggs toward a portion containing meaningfully more protein. A weekly routine built primarily around jogging shifts toward 2 or 3 focused strength sessions, with walking or cycling supplementing rather than dominating. Small adjustments compounding steadily across months. None of this demands extremity. It demands precision, matching input to what your particular biology at this particular age actually requires to respond favorably. There's also a psychological dividend worth mentioning. Men following a strategy calibrated correctly for their stage of life tend to stay consistent longer, simply because results arrive faster and more visibly. Momentum builds when effort produces feedback. That feedback loop, input, response, motivation, continued input, is often the missing ingredient behind programs that fail not from bad intentions, but from mismatched expectations. Point 5. The honest summary standard advice isn't malicious. It's simply generic, built around an average that no longer reflects where your body currently stands. The research reality is more specific, more demanding in certain respects, and considerably more effective for a man past 50. Prioritize protein. Prioritize resistance training. Allow cardiovascular work and calorie awareness to support that foundation rather than replace it. That's not resisting decline. That's understanding your own physiology closely enough to collaborate with it, instead of applying instructions calibrated for someone 30 years younger, borrowed from a generation of guidance that never accounted for where your body actually stands today. Reclaiming genuine power after 50 isn't about outrunning time. It's about supplying your body the specific input it's actually requesting, protein it can use, resistance it must respond to, consistency it rewards. Nothing described here requires a gym membership, exotic supplements, or hours carved from an already crowded schedule. It requires accurate information, applied steadily. Men who make this particular adjustment, shifting emphasis toward protein and resistance rather than restriction and mileage, commonly report the change within weeks. Steadier energy through the afternoon, clothes fitting differently around the midsection, stairs feeling less like a negotiation. Small, measurable signals that the underlying strategy is finally aligned with the body executing it. The 5 exercises come next, each one chosen deliberately, each one earning its place in this routine for a specific physiological reason. 2 ideas carry the weight here. Calorie cutting alone strips away muscle your body needs, and cardio by itself skips the resistance signal that keeps you strong. Protein and targeted resistance training done consistently are what actually rebuild power at this stage of life. Decline was never the inevitable part. Mismatched strategy was. If this gives you something useful, subscribe to Primespan After 50 and turn on the notification bell for another research-backed video on longevity science, vitality for healthy living. I'll see you there.